Oh, I'm sorry. Do you need to finish that up?
I'm just going to give you a copy of the report.
Okay.
I'm so used to saying, oh yeah.
Okay. Good evening. I'm reopening the hearing regarding the comprehensive permit for property at 455 Harvard Street, which is proposing to construct 17 residential units, including 4 affordable units and 1,735 square feet of retail space. I am Kate Potterman. I am chairing today's hearing. With me is Christopher Hussey and Lark Palermo. Also up here with us is Polly Selko, the Assistant Director for Planning, and Karen Martin. Today's hearing is being transcribed and taped. The transcript will be posted on the website, ideally 2 weeks after the hearing date. If you come up to the podium, identify yourself, including your address, and speak clearly. So, for tonight's rules, we have to end ideally around 9 o'clock since Ms. Palermo has an unexpected conflict and needs to leave. So that gives us a good motivation to be quick tonight. So this will mean for speakers, no clapping in between speakers, no shouting, no interrupting, no speaking to each other while the hearing is going on. And if you want to carry on a conversation, please go outside. So as you all know, this is our 4th hearing. At the first one, the applicant presented the proposal. Second one, we heard some recommendations and took public testimony. We had a site visit, yada, yada. Anyway, tonight, what is going on, we have Judy Barrett, who is our distinguished expert on 40B applications, and she will explain the parameters of 40B and the review process and what we as the ZBA are constrained by and encouraged by, etc. And we will also hear the traffic and parking peer reviews who will present their reports. If we have time, we would love to hear from the audience and neighbors. If we don't have time tonight, we will figure out how to do that in our next hearing. Then we will hopefully have time for a planning staff report, unless, Polly, you'd like to go right after Judy's report.
Yes. Please.
Okay, great. Anyway, let's start now and be efficient. Judy, would you like to begin the process?
Sure. Am I projecting somewhere tonight? Or is this being presented, or the slides?
Do you have
I thought you were going to set up the slide presentation. Did you send it to us? You've had it, but forever. We've used it here many times.
While our infrastructure is being set up.
Yeah, Judy, why don't you just do it orally? I think that'll be fine.
Let me try to help everybody. It's not a problem. It's fine.
Yes, Judy could do this in her sleep, as we all know. We could do this in our sleep.
Okay. So maybe because I don't have the whole slide presentation with me tonight, I actually can meet the brevity expectations of the chair. My name is Judy Barrett. I do a lot of work with boards of appeal around the Commonwealth. I'm here to really help the board work through comprehensive permit proceedings. And I just want to tell you a little bit about what this law is and what the obligations are of the board and of the town and of the applicant. So this law was enacted in 1969 at a time when a lot of residents of cities were moving out into the suburbs. And the legislature had a big concern about what was going to happen to city centers as people left these areas. So Chapter 40B is a directive to communities to provide their regional fair share of affordable housing. And the standard for determining whether that regional fair share is met is that every community is supposed to have at least 10% of their year-round housing stock as affordable housing. And what that means, the definition of affordability is based on percentages of a regional area median income. So just to put numbers around this, if you were thinking about a household of 4, you're thinking roughly about a household with an annual income of about $66,000. That's typically what we talk about with Chapter 40B. We sometimes talk about lower incomes, but that is typically what we're referring to. And so an applicant who comes to the town with a development that includes at least 25% of the units as affordable, targeted to that income range or below, is essentially entitled to an expedited process, provided they submit a complete application to the board and all the materials the board needs to make a decision are available. They're entitled to a presumption, if the community is under that 10% limit, that the regional need for affordable housing outweighs a lot of local concerns. Now, that doesn't mean the board has to approve every comprehensive permit that comes before it, but it does set a very high bar. Before the applicant ever gets here, they have to go through what you would call a pre-approval process with a state agency. It is sometimes an agency called Mass Housing. It might be Mass Housing Partnership, but they have to submit essentially what I would call, in layman's terms, a pre-qualification package. And the subsidizing agency, as we call them, is obligated to review the project, review the site, and make a determination if the Board of Appeals granted a comprehensive permit for this development, as we have seen it, we would likely fund it. That's really what they're saying. And so they go through a review process, they look at the site, they meet with the town, and they issue what's called a project eligibility letter if they determine that the project is worthy to go to the Board of Appeals. So there's a whole process that happens before it ever gets here, and there's a process that happens afterwards with the Board of Appeals as well. The board has to review the project with an eye toward, are we at 10% or not? And if we're not, then there's, as I said, this sort of expectation that there will be deference to the regional need for affordable housing. The board can review and consider concerns that relate to the physical and design characteristics of the site. So environmental impact, open space, design, architectural and site design are valid considerations for the board to look at. Those are kinds of things a board would look at for any type of development. Transportation or traffic impacts, those are things that are within the board's purview. What's not in the board's purview are things like who's going to decide who gets to live in the housing, and how much money can a developer make. That all sort of falls in the realm of the subsidizing agency's purview. But however, the board does need to be careful if it's going to impose conditions relating to our environmental impact, design, open space, those physical and design considerations I referred to. The board needs to make sure that it's not imposing conditions that will render the project uneconomic. And that's a financing term that I won't try to sort of explain the details of tonight, except to point out that in the world of Chapter 40B, the question about economics has to do with, can I take this permit to the bank and get financing? Is my project going to meet all the requirements that a lender would expect me to meet? In the end, do I have the right ratios? Do I have a return on total cost that's going to make sense? All this sort of analysis gets done. The board doesn't need to do that, but the board needs to kind of be conscious that when they're imposing conditions on a project, if they make it uneconomic, and that's an if, the developer has a right to go to what was at least designed to be an expedited appeal process. It isn't really, but the developer can go to an entity called the Housing Appeals Committee, which is sort of a sub-agency inside the Department of Housing and Community Development. And the developer would argue, gee, they put these conditions on my project and they've made it uneconomic, and I can prove that. And generally speaking, if they can show that the conditions the board imposes have made the project uneconomic, the Housing Appeals Committee will generally, because of the deference in the law to affordable housing, the Housing Appeals Committee will generally find in favor of the applicant. Unless there is an overwhelming local concern that no matter what the board did, and no matter what conditions the board put on the project, that you couldn't sort of alleviate a local concern. And there's this balancing test the board has to do. Well, if we impose this condition or we impose this requirement on an applicant, have we made the project uneconomic? We probably shouldn't do that because we're going to get overturned at the state level. But if there is a compelling reason for the board to impose that condition anyway, just know that you're going to end up in an appeal. It's always preferable in these cases for a board to try to avoid, if possible, unless there's no other remedy, a denial. The board can do three things when a comprehensive permit comes in. They can approve it with conditions that are within that jurisdiction I described earlier, or they can deny. If the board denies a comprehensive permit and the town is not at that 10% threshold, the strong probability is that the board's decision will be overturned because the law gives such deference to the regional need for affordable housing that absent some overwhelming environmental impact that simply can't be mitigated by any ordinary means or legitimate means, the Housing Appeals Committee will simply overturn the board's decision. And so then any conditions the board might have put on the project, you don't get to impose. So we generally try, if we can, to work with communities around coming up with a permit that has conditions that don't render the project uneconomic, and try to avoid, if possible, an appeal situation. If it's unavoidable, it's unavoidable, and you have to do the best job that you can, and this board has done really a remarkable job with the several comprehensive permits that have come before it. So I have tremendous faith that the board will do the same thing in this case. But really, I think what I want you to understand is that the law is designed to create affordable housing. It is designed to overcome local rules and regulations that would otherwise be an impediment to the creation of that housing. That's what we're here for. That's what the whole law is about. So if you're going to venture into that realm of, I don't think this project's going to work, or I don't think that project's going to work, you need to have tremendous professional evidence on your side in preparation for an appeal, and otherwise what you tried to do is get the best project you can for your town. So I think that really is sort of a wrap around those many slides that I usually go through when I'm here. Sorry, Allison.
Did you go through the Amesbury standards?
Yeah, there's a case that came up several years ago in the high courts of Massachusetts called Zoning Board of Appeals of Amesbury. And in that case, the board had tried to venture into conditions that the court later found were beyond the board's jurisdiction. When I said earlier, the board can look at design, site design, building design, environmental impact, adequacy of open space on the site or open space implications. The board can also look at the relationship between a proposed project and a community's planning. It can do those things. But when it comes to determining how the property will be marketed, who will have first opportunity to choose the units, or how the tenant or homeowner selection process will be done, whether the town or the subsidizing agency kind of has the final say over what constitutes too much profit, the board said, that's beyond your reach. So we kind of work with those Amesbury standards in these cases in an attempt to sort of focus the board's attention on plan review, because it's really, in some ways, like almost any other project, the focus is the plan and the project, and not the sort of, tangentials around what is the public benefit, who determines the public benefit, as I said, who gets to live in the housing, and who gets to decide whether there's excess profit. So all those considerations that would never come up in a subdivision or some other kind of development, really the board has to go hands off on those things. That's kind of what the principle of the Amesbury decision was. Did you have a specific question
Well,
about?
I know there are some cases which say that health and safety issues can be considered, and I don't know where that comes in relation to Amesbury.
Oh,
for
health and
example.
safety is a significant consideration. I'm sorry I didn't mention that. Health and safety is probably the biggest issue that the board can look at. And so if there is a concern about traffic safety, pedestrian safety, fire safety or something like that, the board needs to be able to line up its ducks in a row, because no doubt an applicant will come in and say, I've looked at all those issues and everything is fine. So the board is going to want to accept and document testimony from your local police department, from your local fire department. If it turns out that there's a disagreement between the applicant's team and your local staff, you bring in a peer review consultant, as the board has often done, to try to make sure that the board has the best professional advice, not to knock the staff, because the staff here are wonderful, but you need to be able to almost get some independent advice outside the town, and for someone to take a fresh look at the project. So health and safety they're valid considerations, but again, everything is about this balancing test. Everything is about the balancing test. If there's a way to remedy or reduce a safety concern, or if you can't legitimize the safety concern because you don't really have adequate professional evidence to that effect, you probably don't want to go there. You need to make sure that you have the information from a neutral party that says there is a problem here that can't be remedied through any other means. Because the law, the preference of the law, the deference of the law is to the regional need for affordable housing. Does that help, Kate?
Yes, I just want to make sure that it's a very confusing subject for everybody, and I think that it would help people to know that those are some of the things we need to consider.
Sure. So, go ahead. Allison's handing me a couple of notes of things she wants me to make sure I go over. So if I don't have my slides, I sometimes forget. That's okay. Chris, what was your question?
Judy, I'm glad you talked at length about the Housing Appeals Committee, because I hadn't been so sure of that up to now. And it sounds to me as though if the applicants, traffic and parking consultants and the peer consultants all agree that there is no serious hazard or risk to pedestrians and so forth, that it would be very difficult to have that as the reason to deny the project and have it not overturned by the appeals board. Is that?
Well, the standard is the project creating a condition that's new? And to what extent is the project responsible for mitigating its own impact? Often these questions come up on a site or in a situation, a context where there may be some existing concerns about vehicular traffic or pedestrian safety, but understand that those existing conditions are not the problem of the applicant. Those are the town's problem. And so if you have concern about traffic or pedestrian safety in an area, the issue is for the town to solve. It's not really for the applicant. If the applicant is contributing to a worsening of that condition, then the applicant has, I guess you would call it, sort of an incremental contribution to solving the problem, but not to fix the problem in its entirety because they didn't create it. So something else I just want to mention, again without my slides, I only have memory to go by here. The board has 180 days to complete this process from the opening of the hearing. And I kind of lost track as to where you are on that, but certainly if you get toward the end of that 180-day period and you're making progress and you need a little more time, typically an applicant will agree to a modest extension. But of course, you would not want to rely on that opening the hearing. So the board has to be making kind of a good faith effort throughout to comply with that 180-day regulatory requirement. That's not in the statute, but it is in the regulations, and so it's a burden the board requires. The other thing that I should just mention vis-a-vis Amesbury is that the board can't consider things like the fiscal impact of the project. I actually just gave a talk on this today at a conference out in Central Mass. You can't look at things, you can't impose requirements on a 40B that are not imposed on other types of development in your community. It's in the statute. You just can't impose requirements that go beyond what you would impose on any other development. So you need to be careful looking at impacts that would be the impacts of really kind of any kind of development, and every development sort of does its fair share to address those impacts, but those are kind of community service issues that are not part of the 40B process. So
to follow up on that, sorry, Chris, my understanding is that something which is very frustrating to Brookline is that even though our schools are overloaded, we cannot consider the fact that 40Bs will add to the school population. Is that correct?
You cannot consider the fiscal impact of the project on the schools. You can't. I mean, the Housing Appeals Committee won't even accept that testimony. I know because I've testified there before. They won't even accept it into the record.
Mm-hmm.
Judy, I think it might be helpful to also talk a little bit more about the beginning of the process that you called
with the subsidizing agency?
Approval. Right, because there's certain areas that they have reviewed and approved.
Yep.
And I believe they're not subject to our review and approval. We essentially are required to take at face value what the subsidizing agency has agreed to in its project eligibility letter.
The subsidizing agency has two key questions. I mean, there are 4 or 5 criteria in the regulations, but the two key questions are, if this project were permitted at the local level, would it meet our funding requirements? Would we fund this project? That's really the main question the subsidizing agency has to answer, because they're in the business of subsidizing housing. The second question is the site generally appropriate? So they will not get into the detailed review that your board does because you know your town better than a subsidizing agency does. But if it's a site that's generally in a residential area, or in a site that's in a mixed-use area and there's, a fair amount of housing around it, subsidizing agency, or depending upon what your zoning says, the subsidizing agency isn't going to say, well, this site isn't appropriate for multifamily. And that's always the question is, how do you fit multifamily housing with other types of housing around it? They're not going to go there. They assume that you will handle that. And, you know, I mean, I'll be perfectly honest with you, I think it makes it hard for the board because the assumption is that the project as proposed is appropriate for the site. And so if it's not, then the burden really shifts to you to sort of document why that's not the case. I would never want to say to any board I've worked with, you're stuck with the subsidizing agency's decision, because they're not going to look at it the way you are. They don't look at the traffic impacts. They don't look at any of that. But there is a presumption that if the applicant has that approval from a subsidizing agency, which comes in the form of this project eligibility letter, and if the applicant is an eligible entity, which is either a public agency, a nonprofit organization, or a limited dividend organization, which is typically what we see, and if the applicant has site control, if they meet all those conditions, which a project eligibility letter is a presumption that they meet, then the applicant has a right to be in front of you and has a right to expect that the board will, in the end, issue what I like to call a unified permit, because that's essentially what this is. The board's jurisdiction picks up all the local permitting that would otherwise happen. So the applicant doesn't have to go to the planning board, would only go to the Conservation Commission if the project triggered state law, would only deal with the Board of Health if somehow the project triggered state law, but everything that would be handled locally is handled here. And the logic is to give one permit and expedite the process.
You identified one thing that has come up in the hearings here, and it's site control.
Yes.
In this particular case, the applicant has leased the land to a restaurant.
Yep.
And statements have been made in the public hearings that there are problems with the lease and that the applicant may not have control based on potential legal issues with the tenant. It's my understanding that it is not within our purview to question the project eligibility letter's statement that the applicant has, that they have done the due diligence to determine whether the site control exists.
It's pretty clear in the state regulations that if an applicant comes to you with a project eligibility letter, there is a presumption that they've met those 3 statutory requirements, and those are statutory requirements. Now, that said, if a project were in front of you and it changed significantly in the course of the review, you would certainly be within your rights to communicate back to the subsidizing agency and ask them, is this a significant enough change? We kind of went through this on another project, I think, here. Is this a significant enough change to warrant a revisiting of the project eligibility letter? Their typical stance is they don't want to get involved again when this is going on. They will look at it later. And maybe I should just mention this. Once you grant your permit, they're not over. There's still a lot that has to happen. There's a whole, what we call, final approval process with the subsidizing agencies. That can take forever. People think boards of appeal are slow. Final approval letter at process at Mass Housing is quite demanding. And so they will look at all of that again, but they typically don't get involved while it's in the review process locally unless there's some real significant question. But I would say if you have a concern about that, you're well within your rights to ask the subsidizing agency for comment. They probably will say, we'll look at it during final approval. I can't speak for them, but that I wouldn't be surprised.
Thanks.
No problem.
Got one more question.
Please.
The 2 main objections from the neighborhoods in general, you've touched on both of them. One is the hazard, the safety, and the other has to do with the building itself, the design, the massing, the height, the nearness to other buildings that are not as big and what have you. How important is the peer review's opinion in this kind of situation? That is, if the peer reviewer, say the architectural peer reviewer, does not see a problem in that area, what's the chance of us stating that we're turning it down on that basis and not having it get through the appeals committee? Would you guess?
Slim to none.
Thank you very much. That's what I was afraid you'd say.
I think if you did, because you had other policy reasons, you know, I hate to sound like I'm tying your hands, because I don't think that's my role, but
Right.
I'm trying to also give you a reality check. I think that if the board decided that there was a height issue, regardless of what the peer review architect said, you better be prepared going into an appeal to have another architectural review, because believe me, the applicant will ask your peer review consultant to come in and testify.
Or different evidence, different types of evidence, whether it was safety
Sure.
or
All of the above, Kate, all of the
something.
above.
Right.
Thank you.
Any other questions from the board? or anyone, yes.
Yes, Mr. Engler, would you like to ask a question? Could you please identify yourself?
Sure. Would the board like me to?
Yeah.
Please.
For the record, Jeff Angler from SCB, 40B consultant representing the applicant. I appreciate Judy's thorough explanation. I just have one real point of clarification. She said 40B is the affordable units are intended for people earning up to 80% of area median income, which is a certain income level. In fact, there are two programs that are allowed. You can do 25% up to 80, or 20% of the total units for households earning up to 50%, which is the program, in this case, my client has selected, whereas in fact, they're doing more affordability. By law, under this program, you have to do 20%, and they're doing 23.5% affordability. And what that means to people in the audience that don't quite understand, basically the affordable units here will be set at a rent for households earning up to 50% of area median income.
Put a dollar number on that, Jeff, just to help it.
Yeah, I would say give or take $1,000 a month, $1,100 a month, give or take for the affordable units, as opposed to units priced or set at households earning up to 80%, which would probably be closer to $1,500.
And those are for the larger
give or take.
units, is that correct?
Well, those are for the four affordable units.
Right, but the different sized bedrooms is what I'm saying.
Oh, it was a generic, yeah. It varies by bedroom type, so the different, a bigger bedroom, 2 bedrooms have a higher rent than 1 bedroom, 1 bedroom, so on and so forth. So I just wanted to, because I know that was mentioned by the Neighbors Council at the last hearing, that we were not meeting our affordability requirement, and I don't think he was clear that we're doing 50% units instead of 80% units. So.
Actually, your unit mix was confusing. I was looking at that myself. And this is news to me, they've switched to the 2080. So what are the exact numbers and the breakdown in terms of, so 17 units, how many are
We never
affordable?
switched. It was always 4 units, always 4
4
affordable.
units? Okay, so that's
It's
about
4
25% still.
Well,
Or
23 and a
25 plus.
half, yeah.
Okay,
4
great.
of 17.
Okay, fantastic.
So that's all I wanted to say. I didn't have anything else to say.
Great, thank you.
And one other thing, I'm sorry, I can't help myself. There was a question raised before about site control. A, I agree, it's not the board's purview, it's a subsidizing agency. But B, as a matter of record, my client has a lease with the tenant for a new property, so any allegations or intimations that he or she is leaving against their will and being thrown out is not accurate. He has a lease for another property that he likes better than the one he currently has, so hopefully we can just bring the site control issue to bed.
Great.
Thank you.
All right, colleagues, do you have anything else you would like to ask Judy? Judy, is there anything you would like to add?
No, not at this time. I think if something comes up during the process, I'm here.
Fantastic.
All right,
Thank you very much. Actually, while you're here, could we take one of the questions from the audience? That would be helpful. Actually, why don't you come up and introduce yourself, just so we know who you are for the record. And we do need to move quickly through this. I apologize. I know Judy is a very valuable resource.
I'm Sue Hasman. I'm from 46 Columbia Street, Brookline, of course. And the question for Ms. Barrett is, how do you
Wait,
measure?
speak into the,
How does
microphone.
one measure the volume of community opposition, discomfort, whatever, with a package? I mean, that was alluded to as a character, but I don't know what the metric is on that.
I'm not sure what you're asking. I mean, where does it play a role? Is that what you're asking?
I thought I heard you mentioning about considering opposition from the community, and I don't know how opposition from the community is measured. That's a very squishy.
No, it's really, if a neighborhood has concerns, typically most developers will try, if they can, to work with the neighborhood. It makes the board's job much easier. But, the board's job is to try to get the best project they can for the town, given all of the the considerations that the board is allowed to make. And so community opposition is certainly one consideration, but for each issue that neighbors may be concerned about, the board then tries to get independent input. How serious is the traffic issue? Can it be mitigated? How significant is the design issue? Can it be mitigated? It isn't that the board doesn't hear what the neighborhood opposition is, but the law, this is different from a special permit under the Zoning Act. This law defers to the need for affordable housing, whereas many types of other permits under the Zoning Act kind of defer to a whole lot of other considerations. But when it's a Chapter 40B comprehensive permit, the board's first duty is to defer to the need for affordable housing wherever possible.
And I know that's extremely frustrating to hear.
Yeah,
But
I know.
personally, I find the neighborhood's participation and voice very important. And I find that issues brought up by the neighborhood are also very helpful because it gives us more information, and the more information we have, the better decision we can make.
Right. It's true.
Okay, on to Polly. Thank you very much, Judy.
I'm Polly Selko, Assistant Director of Regulatory Planning. Tonight, we're going to be discussing parking and traffic, but I just wanted to take a minute to discuss design issues. The planning staff and Cliff Bomer, who's our peer reviewer on design, met with the applicant's team to discuss design issues. And the bottom line is that they are still working on design issues and are going to be making some changes, which I think at the July 12th meeting, they'll be able to present to this board. So that's not being ignored, but we're going to wait to hear anything about the changes because they're still working on them. I don't know, Jeff, if you wanted to add anything to that.
I think that's an accurate representation. We did have that meeting, was productive, and Peter, who you know, and my client are evaluating those suggestions, and I think you'll see that the revised plans do represent or factor in a lot of the things that Mr. Bomer and to a certain extent the board and the neighbors have communicated. We thought it made sense to have the benefit of the comments on traffic and parking as well, because those can have a design component. So we'll hear that. I mean, we've seen the letters, obviously. We'll hear tonight the testimony, and then we can factor everything together because some of those concerns have a design component as well. So prior to the 12th, we'll get the plans to the board, to Mr. Bomer, and then we'll do a full presentation on those updated plans. And relative to one other comment about neighborhood input, my client has had discussions recently with one of the neighbors that retained Mr. Hill, and we expect to have a larger discussion in the coming weeks about some of those concerns.
Great.
And I would say I can represent, I think before the 12th, those will have occurred as well. So.
One of the things I want to raise is with summer coming, and this being our fourth meeting, the 6 months is up in September. So if we're in June, we started in March. So March, June, July, August, well, whatever. It's ending in September. So I think we need to at least plan some meetings and set some dates aside, at least a couple per month. We can always cancel them. But with vacations coming up, I really think we need to start working on meetings more frequently, just in case we need to discuss design, whatever.
Right, but we have to keep in mind that they need time to make the revisions to come back to us so that the meetings are profitable.
Right, so after July 12th,
Well, why don't we discuss that? We have the July 12th date. I know that the applicant's team can make it that evening, the board can make it, and we will pick a couple of more dates. I can poll everybody.
sure, yeah,
And
but
let
I just
people
don't want to
know.
happen July 12th, August 12th, September 12th, oops. That's what I'm afraid
No,
of.
we'll make sure that doesn't
Okay,
happen.
great, all right,
Okay, we're ready for the traffic and parking peer reviewers.
fantastic. Mr. Fitzgerald?
Thank you very much. Again, my name is Jim Fitzgerald, and I'm with Environmental Partners Group. and performed the traffic peer review on Vanessa and Associates' May 5th, 2017 traffic assessment for the redevelopment of 455 Harvard Street. The site is anticipated, as you know, to be redeveloped into 17 apartment units and 1,735 square feet of retail. It's located within relatively close proximity to a number of public transportation options, including especially the bus route 66 stop, which is only a block away. There's also the bus stops for Route 57, 57A, and the B and C branches of the Green Line, all of which are within 1,600 to 2,500 feet of the site. The proposal includes an access along Thorndike Street, closing the 2 existing curb cuts, installing one in the center, and removal of a curb cut along Harvard Street. The 42-foot-long curb cut along Harvard Street is anticipated to become a temporary loading zone and trash pickup location for a 4-hour period in the morning. Some of the documentation shows that 4 hours falls between 5 to 9 a.m. Others show 6 to 10 a.m. During all other times, the space, that 42-foot length, will be used for 2 metered parking spaces. Intersection safety was reviewed in the document using information provided by the local police department, identifying 3 crashes during a 3-year period of 2014 to 2016, only one crash per year. We looked up some Mass DOT crash data as well. During the time period of 2011 to 2014, that's a 4-year period, there were 6 crashes according to Mass DOT, so according to Mass DOT, it's about 1.5 crashes per year. Trip generation was performed in order to determine the number of trips being generated by the site using the Institute of Transportation Engineers, ITE's trip generation manual. The apartment usage was a pretty straightforward computation using Land Use Code 220. For the retail component, it got a little bit more confusing or less accurate, I should say. The land use code used was 826 Specialty Retail Center, which fits the description of what's being proposed here. Unfortunately, the data points available in ITE are very limited for this land use code. For instance, in the evening peak hour, there are only 5 data points available. All developments are substantially greater in size than this one, 15,000 square feet to 215,000 square feet versus our 1,700 square foot development for retail. So we did a little bit further digging in ITE. Unfortunately, there's not really a great application for this scale of retail use. We looked at other land use codes such as 820 and coming up with similar volumes, but same issue of much larger scale developments. Given the small scale of this retail component, we anticipate that the number of trips generated by it are approximate. Depending on what specific retail uses go in there, that would really shed more light onto the number of trips. But I would suspect we're talking about a difference of a trip or 2 per hour, so it's not substantial. There were reductions taken on the trips generated by the site because of the numerous options for public transportation in the area. This was based on the 2010 to 2014 commuting to work information, included a reduction of about 55%, which appears to be reasonable and has been used on other projects as well in the area. This is a reasonable reduction for the apartment usage, again, commuting to work. This same reduction was used, however, on the retail component. Since the reduction is based on commuting to work, we didn't feel that that was appropriate, although we do recognize that depending on the type of retail that goes into this site, there would be likely some sort of reduction taken for pass-by business, or if it's a convenience store, maybe perhaps some of the residents in the apartments might use the store, etc. So we asked for additional clarification on that. In the end, based on the assumptions made in the report, there were 5 trips generated in the morning peak hour, that's 2 entering and 3 exiting, and 7 trips during the evening peak hour, that's 4 entering and 3 exiting. So relatively low traffic volumes for this scale development, certainly. A question was raised having to do with the lack of analysis for Saturday, because if there is a retail component, typically retail's peak falls along a Saturday, although probably negligible given the 1,700 square foot size of the retail is relatively small, depending on what goes into that site. Site distance was perhaps the biggest concern having to do with the development. The Harvard Street Thorndike intersection was looked at for site distance, namely the Thorndike Street approach, because all the proposed traffic will be accessing this intersection via Thorndike, versus the current site has the Thorndike driveway access is closed currently, so the site currently accesses Harvard Street instead. The applicant identified the 85th percentile speeds along northbound Harvard Street as 26 miles an hour, and along southbound Harvard Street as 27 miles per hour. The data was not provided, however, for us to verify that. We looked into intersection site distance and stopping site distance. Ultimately, according to AASHTO, which is what we reference for standards, if the available site distance for an entering or crossing vehicle is at least equal or approximate to the stopping site distance for the major road, then drivers have sufficient site distance to anticipate and avoid collisions. So based on this location, if you were sitting at the Thorndike Street approach to Harvard Street, you would be required to have 173 feet of stopping site distance. And what we're measuring, looking to the right, because the parcel as you're on Thorndike Street approaching Harvard is on your right, currently there's only 80 feet available for site distance under existing conditions, because there is a parking space right adjacent to the intersection. However, just beyond that parking space is the existing curb cut opening where there is no parking, because that's how they access the restaurant currently. So there is some level of additional site distance if you were to be able to look between that one parked vehicle, if there was a parked vehicle there, and the existing bush on the existing property. So we estimate about a disrupted site distance of about 190 feet under existing conditions. Now, under proposed conditions, that curb cut is anticipated to now become on-street parking during the majority of the day, or loading or trash pickup during those 4 hours in the morning. So in addition to that, there will be obviously a large structure along the back edge of sidewalk. So we anticipate that the addition of these features would worsen the site distance even further from this approach when you're looking to the right. As a result, what we had suggested considering in our memorandum was the idea of bump outs or curb extensions. It allows provides the opportunity to push the stop line, the crosswalk and the stop line further in towards Harvard Street a bit more, so that you can see oncoming traffic easier. More around those parked vehicles. It also serves many other purposes. It does help to shorten crossing distance, which helps reduce the exposure that pedestrians have when they're crossing the street, the exposure that they have to oncoming traffic. And it also helps to calm traffic. You know, anytime you narrow a roadway, you're slowing traffic down, typically. The site distance from Thorndike Street, along Thorndike Street at the site site driveway was not covered in the memorandum. It was covered, however, in a presentation that applicant had given dated May 15th, but there was no backup provided to it or computations provided, so we requested in our memorandum that information be provided. We anticipate that there might be some site distance issues having to do with if a vehicle is exiting the garage, stops behind the sidewalk and not impacting the flow of pedestrians walking by. Will they be able to see oncoming traffic adequately if the building corners are located where they appear to be located right now? I should point out, however, that there is adequate sight distance between the pedestrians and that vehicle exiting the driveway in accordance to the local zoning bylaw. So I want to also point out the site driveway currently is only dimensioned at 19 feet wide, but I believe the zoning requirement is for a 20-foot wide opening. And also the curb cut is somewhat narrow. So as a result, in order for a vehicle to turn out of the driveway, exiting the driveway and swing right, they would likely be going into the opposing stream of traffic. To further complicate things, there is on-street parking on the opposite side of Thorndike Street, so perhaps that curb cut opening could be widened up a bit to make that a little bit easier of a movement to keep traffic on the right side of the road. Looking into the loading zone and trash pickup, again, this was proposed along that existing 42-foot long curb cut that is along Harvard Street. And the one thing that we want to note there is that there is a driveway transition proposed at that location. Even though there is no driveway along the back edge of sidewalk, it appears to be a driveway transition sloping up. And what we would recommend is for there to be a vertical granite curb, 6-inch curb reveal, to provide protection for the pedestrians. And that concludes the traffic peer review. I don't know if you'd like to roll right into the parking with Art, Stedek, and Walker.
No, let's separate the two.
Okay.
Ms. Palermo, do you have any questions?
I don't, but I will once we hear from the parking
Okay.
reviewer,
Sure.
because they are all connected.
Mr. Hussey?
I've got a question, I guess, about the bump out feature to reduce the problems at the corner of Thorndike and Harvard Street. I don't see any sketch in your report. Is the architect going to have a drawing that'll show that? I don't quite understand what.
Sure. So let me just
elements are.
explain it real quick. So if you envision the edge of Harvard Street, right now we have one lane of vehicle travel in each direction. Outside of that is a bike lane. Outside of that is on-street parking. So bump outs, what they do is they extend the curb out to almost the distance of the bike lane. We don't want to impact bike circulation at all.
Right.
It just bumps it out where they're into that parking lane where technically no parking is allowed that close to the intersection. It just kind of extends the sidewalk out further. What that does in this case is that helps to push the crosswalk and the stop line coming from Thorndike into Harvard Street a little bit more, so you have a better viewpoint of oncoming traffic.
You're impinging on town control land though, right?
Correct.
So how does the developer get that done? I mean, what if the engineering department doesn't allow it?
That is
I think I can address that.
yeah.
They will need to go to the Transportation Board for a recommendation, and the Transportation Board will give you a recommendation. However, Town Council has opined that really it's this board that can make that decision.
Okay. All right.
Although I assume the board would expect the developer to pay for it.
And who is talking?
Allison Steinfeld.
Okay. Anything else, Mr. Hussey?
That'll do it for the moment.
Related to the bump, as your report, very thorough report notes, the Thorndike Street intersection into Harvard is not at a 90-degree angle. So my question is whether or not the bump out would make the turn left from Harvard Street onto Thorndike Street more complicated.
Whenever you do any sort of geometric changes, you always have to run vehicle templates to make sure whatever you're putting in is not too severe. Certainly, you want to make sure that the vehicles are able to circulate properly, stay in the lane that they're supposed to be. So that would all have to be looked into as part of a design.
And I believe you also commented in your report that one of the ways of making, or one of the contributors, rather, to the difficulty in seeing as a result of the project was because of the extent to which the project is close to the sidewalk, so the size of the project. So could one infer that bringing back the project would improve sightlines?
The problem is, it's kind of a double whammy, because you've got the building along the back edge of sidewalk, and you're also adding parking. So now you've got a solid line of parking, not just that one random parking space on the corner and then an opening. It's just consistent parking, and depending on the size of vehicles and if vehicles are present, that could serve a double whammy. Certainly, the two are related. So if we're able to bump the stop line further out, it helps alleviate the situation, including that parking, which really is a big issue.
But if the parking were taken away, that would eliminate one site problem, is that correct?
If the parking was taken away and the the stop line was extended further out with something like a bump out, that would alleviate the situation.
Mr. Bomer had suggested a possibility where, as I understood it, it was sort of a partial step back, and at least how I envisioned it was like a pediment with the first floor being cut back some, and I guess a cantilever with the second floor, which would allow greater vision, at least around the corner.
Correct. If you were to leave, if you were to bump back the corner a little bit and have that gap in parking that exists today at the existing curb cut, then you would have a similar situation to what you have today. But by adding that loading zone area and parking space, that fills that area in. And also the building on the corner, it's curved, but there are supports that appear to protrude further in that are impacting line of sight.
Okay. Yeah, but that's something,
Well, that could be adjusted, I think.
right, something to consider. Let me look at my notes. All right, why don't we move on to parking?
Okay.
Thank you very much, Mr. Fitzgerald.
Thank you.
Good evening, Art Stadig with Walker Parking Consultants. Walker has reviewed the requirements of the project with respect to parking and have issued a report through Environmental Partners. We had issued a report dated June 2nd for the review. What we had taken a look at was the parking requirements for the project, both in terms of the supply-demand issues and also how the parking operates, et cetera. Our first note was that the proponent has asked for a waiver to deviate from the zoning mandated requirements for parking. In the town's requirements, they do have a transit parking overlay district, which allows a slight reduction in the otherwise required parking spaces. And if you're within a half a mile from a T-stop, you're allowed to have these slightly reduced spaces. I have the spaces listed in the report. When I was reviewing this report earlier before coming here, I noticed I made an arithmetic error, so I apologize for that if that's caused any confusion. But I've listed in there that 27 spaces were required. What I failed to do is add in the required 9 spaces for retail, so the actual number is 36. So I apologize for that. I've got a revised copy of it if you want that will have that correction in there, and I apologize for any craziness or consternation that may have caused you. Regardless, that doesn't change the overall findings in that the proponent is asking for a waiver to provide 12 spaces or 13 shown on the drawings, but call it 13, which is in the order of magnitude of a third of that required. Slight difference with respect to, depending upon which way you count that. So I think that's the big point, is they're providing a third of what's ordinarily required. In addition to that, the parking facility is relatively small, which is fine, and it is employing a semi-automated vertical puzzle parking a system to accommodate the parking. While there's no problem with that technology, everything's perfectly fine with it, what it does lend itself to is more repeat users. So it would lend itself to residents and or employees of the retail. It would not lend itself to either visitors that would come to the residential complex or any type of retail customers that would want to come to the retail. So this parking facility will not accommodate those users as it is anticipated. What I'm requesting in there, because it's such a significant request that to provide only a third of the code or the zoning mandated spaces, that the proponent provide a more definitive defense of providing that large reduction in the required parking. We're suggesting taking a look at a review of the actual residential and retail demand and how that would be accommodated. And there's, for example, within the number of units that they have, there's a various mix. Looking at that, certainly looking at the affordability component of it. And also, a big portion of this would be the intended nature of the retail. As Jim had indicated, there's really no indication of what that could be. So, for example, if it were to be a restaurant type of establishment, that would have a much different parking demand generation than if it were a quiet retail establishment that would only get an occasional visitor or two. And depending upon the type of establishment, whether the customers would be captive to the neighborhood would also have an effect. So would people just walk down the street to go to this establishment, whatever it might be, or is it the type of establishment that might draw something from a little bit further where people might tend to drive? So unless we would know that, it's hard to say exactly what the effect on that is, other than that is not taken into account, generally speaking, with the parking reduction that is being requested. And then finally, pricing of parking and the idea or concept of a market rate for parking has a huge effect on parking demand in general. So, for example, if parking were free, the demand would go up. If parking is very high priced, the demand would go down. And in light that this is affordable units, how that plays into it would also be part of it. So to the extent that we're just asking that pricing portion, as it would inform or affect the parking demand, be at least discussed and brought about. We had made a slight comment on the parking peak hour volume. Jim had covered that. Really nothing that we're saying is really contrary to that. We're not saying that there is any issue at all. We take no exception to what was indicated. Our third item is that the garage door within the facility is only 16 feet wide. And I say only 16 feet wide in a sense that this is a small, primarily residential parking facility. That would not necessarily be a problem. What we're pointing out is that it only allows enough dimension for a one-way movement. Either you can come in predominantly or you can leave, but you really can't have two-way action with that narrow of a door and with the geometrics of all that's going on inside the facility and out. So what that will occasionally do as someone may be leaving and somebody maybe trying to come in at the same time, that person on the street would have to wait. And that might have slight impacts on traffic right in front of the facility there. We make some comments about how the semi-automated system might work inside. We believe it can absolutely work, and there would be no problems. It would just need some care and some special attention might be needed to take a look at that and see how the best way to make that work. But absolutely, there shouldn't be any problem with that. The City Lift puzzle parking system was provided as a reference. There may be some additional requirements about how that's laid out and whether the columns are in the way, et cetera, more design issues to actually achieve the parking count and dimensions that they indicate. The point would be, will the town mandated zoning requirements for parking dimensions be met by this system? We don't know. It's certainly possible, but that would be details that would have to be ferreted out later on. Okay, so I'd open it up to questions if you have any.
Ms. Palermo.
I just have a couple of questions, and thank you for clarifying the math.
And I apologize again.
No,
That was
it's not
error.
my forte, and I kept adding it up and going, I'm not
That
coming
doesn't
up with
work,
this
right.
number. Okay, and that helps a lot, because the retail space does require 9 parking spaces under the
Yes.
zoning code. And the residential units would require the 23, did you come up with
27,
27?
based on the slight requirements of the overlay district. So 27 plus 9 is the 36.
Which is actually less than would typically be required,
Right.
but for the overlay district.
Correct. It was previously 43 or 44, depending
Right.
upon rounding.
Right,
Okay?
right, okay. So the town has taken into consideration the fact that this site has good access to public transportation in its zoning bylaw by the overlay district.
Yes.
Yeah. And you've identified something that I found quite interesting, which is clearly the importance of retail use. There's a variety of reasons it's important, but in particular, we don't have any standard that will allow us to assess with a 1,700 approximately square foot retail space, what traffic would be generated by that?
You could approximate, and it would be extremely helpful if the nature of that retail would be established. So for example, like I said, if it were a restaurant, that would be one thing. If it were a quiet jewelry store, that's something else. So depending upon the nature, we could, or Jim could make estimates of the traffic and or parking demand that would be generated from that.
I would find it helpful if you could potentially come up with suggestions, because I would assume that the developer would be amenable to a condition that identified the type of retail uses that would not generate a lot of traffic. But I'd want to know how to make that, in other words, we can't say you must have a jewelry store retail use. That's a little restrictive, but I appreciate the fact that that's not going to generate a lot of traffic. So clearly, the obvious ones are restaurants that would generate more, but, sort of quiet retail uses would be hard for me to define.
Correct. And also the nature of a retail that might tend to be more what we'd call captive. In other words, it's a neighborhood related type of retail establishment, as opposed to something that might be a little bit more regional, if you will, or a regional draw. So if it were a highly specialized store that people would come from a far distance to, they would tend to drive more. just because of the nature of the store. So as opposed to if it were more of a neighborhood bodega or something like that, that would people just walk down, tend to more walk down and not drive to. So that's another issue with that, and, you know, there's just a highly variable situation with retail as to all the different things it could be.
Industry's changing so much, too.
Right, exactly. And so the other thought I had was the 1,700 square feet is proposed to be used for retail, but if it were used for residential and were potentially 2 one-bedroom apartments, that would require 3 spaces?
About an additional 3 spaces if it were 2 one-bedroom units, yeah.
Okay, which could be better in terms of generating traffic and finding a place to put these cars. I also note that the PEL, the project eligibility letter, does reference a requirement that the applicant be prepared to provide sufficient data to assess the potential traffic impacts. And so it sounds like some of the recommendations you're making about identifying the type or the nature of the retail space would comply with this requirement that's in the project eligibility letter as well, if we could get this additional information from the developer.
Yes, my view is, from the parking standpoint, is primarily based on, is the parking supply adequate to meet the requirements? Jim would be a little bit more taking a look at the review of how that would impact traffic, et cetera. Having said that, if not enough parking is provided for what would be anticipated to be the demand for this site, that puts more pressure on the neighborhood and the town to pick up the slack for what parking is not provided in a broad general sense. So that's just the point, you know, for you to think about and consider as you know, the parking supply might not meet the demand that's required for this, you know, this site. Okay?
We don't allow overnight parking on the street in Brookline.
Yes, I'm aware of that.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Hussey?
Yeah, I've got a question on the number of parking spaces between 12 and 13. Now, I count 5 stacker spaces, and those are all 2 parking spaces, right, each stacker?
This is an automated system, so on one side of it, I'm sorry that there's not a plan up there, but there was a plan on the town's website which shows where the parking spaces are located.
Yep.
It is a colored diagram. Yeah, so there.
Not quite.
So it's indicating 11 lift spaces, okay? And it indicates on this diagram that's on the website how they are shown. But basically, one side of the lift goes down and up, so there are 8 spaces there.
5.
There would be 8 spaces here, plus 1 more is 9, plus 3 spaces here. That is 12, plus 1 accessible space is 13.
Let me see, let's see if we got the same thing here. So these are stacker spaces, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 stacker spaces, right?
No, this is more than stackers. Those 3 spaces, those 3 positions would render 8 spaces, because they go both down and up, and then you have 1 empty space. So it's a puzzle system of 9 minus 1 open space, that's 8 parking spaces.
Okay.
This is a puzzle system of 4 minus 1 open space would be 3,
I got you.
okay?
And then the compact space and the,
Yeah, then
Handicap
2 more
space,
spaces there, okay?
so, thanks. The other questions I have are really for the architect. But I noticed you pointed out that the maneuvering around the stair on the north side is pretty tight. But I think there's a way to alleviate that.
We believe that with a little bit of care and the architect can make all of that work out within the parking facility.
I think you can too. Okay, thank you.
The dimensions, thank you, Mr. Hussey. The dimensions of these stalls I could not find anywhere, but when I looked at I was checking to see if they complied with the stall requirements of the town, but when I looked at what the city lift required, it was well in excess, as best I could tell, of what the town requirements were. So to the best of your knowledge, developer, are you going to be using city lift?
We haven't committed to a vendor, but I would say it's likely.
And I know you also had a concern about the stanchions or other pillars that might need to be in place to support a system like the puzzle system. Is that correct?
Yeah, well, basically, columns will be coming down that are supporting the building above.
Right.
So this mechanized system needs to fit in between the columns. What we just don't have is enough information to conclude that it all works. I'm confident that the architect can work all of that out, but at this stage, for this review, we just really can't determine all the dimensions in there. So I'm just pointing it out and saying that those dimensions would need to be fully worked out and vetted later with inspectional services.
Right, so I think that's something, especially since the number of units is in flux, that we would like to nail down exactly how that would work. And I would like to see what is the exact turning study, a model to see how. Yeah, the radii, right, to see cars going in, how they would turn. And I think you said the driveway was 16 feet. Somebody said it was 16 feet. Somebody said it was 19 feet, the
Yeah,
access.
let me clarify that for you real quick. First, when you're referring to turns, I would suggest doing auto turns, which is a program on a derivative of AutoCAD that would help make the turns, which is a common industry practice. So that can be certainly looked at very simply. I'm referencing 16 feet, which is a dimension right at the doorway. Okay, and I believe what Jim was referring to is a curb cut, which is further out, probably a distance of 10, 12 feet away from the door, whatever that dimension is. So what I'm referring to is right there at the entrance to the garage. It's 16 feet wide. And with the way cars have to turn in and out, really only one vehicle can either come in or out at the same time, and they can't have two-way action at that point.
Right, so there'd be the potential of cars queuing, trying to wait for somebody to get in and out.
Every once in a great while that, you're going to have a coincident situation where somebody's trying to leave while somebody's trying to get in. Technology could certainly help with that, to help that situation. That, just something to point out.
Are there ways, what happens if somebody's like downstairs trying to do things? Well, I guess somebody just waits on the approach to it, or has to back up, but doesn't need to be dealt with now.
No, but the point what you're making is if somebody's trying to retrieve a car out of the rack system and somebody's trying to come in,
Yeah,
there could be enough room inside. That would have to be studied to make sure that the two vehicles could pass each other internal to the garage, but certainly not at that doorway getting in and out of the roadway system.
yeah, I mean, it'd be preferable that nobody have to back up and go back into the street for the other car to exit. Is that something that we can include in the radii study? Thank you, Mr. Engler.
Well, I was going to comment. I mean, we're certainly aware of the comments. We can make the internal, we've already talked to Peter, we can widen the internal driveway. There shouldn't be the issue of cars not being able to go both directions at the same time. So I don't have any concern that will not be addressed. We can also do a turning movement analysis that's customary. Lastly, relative to the pillars, I would agree with the comment that we can design to it. You're not going to do a structural plan at this point in time when the design is still in flux. We'll do that once we've confirmed that the building's not moving, at which point we'll have some opportunity to look at that. But we have every confidence that we'll be able to design it so that it's not going to compromise any of the 13 spaces. So
Right.
We'll demonstrate as much as we provide additional details, now that we have the benefit of these two peer-reviewed reports.
One of the things which has surprised me during the course of these hearings is that none of the neighbors have commented on the size of the parking lot or the amount of parking being provided. So I would find it, which is very unusual in 40B hearings, where a request for a waiver is being given to go below the amount of parking that is required by zoning.
Well, can I comment on that?
Yes, I'm just noticing, which has led me to infer that it's not a huge issue. If it is an issue for neighbors, let us know, but I would,
Well, I'm troubled by that assertion, and it says as much in both reports. There is a full-service restaurant on that property now that provides 6 parking spaces, all right? Our future proposed use, at worst, will be equal to that current use in terms of parking and vehicle trips. So I don't know why, I'm not saying it's heavy scrutiny, and the board's certainly well within its right to ask these questions, but our position is going to be that from an intensity of use, we're no worse than what's there now. In fact, we're probably better. Let's figure out a way to maximize the parking we have, and we'll certainly do that, and to make the design as good as possible. But we could put a gas station there that's going to generate 50 times the number of cars that we're going to generate in the proposed use. So I think, we'll work with both peer review and the town on this issue, but it's not like we're going to suddenly miraculously come up with 25 spaces, or nor are we going to do 5-unit development either. So just to set the expectations of the board, that's going to be kind of our position as we move forward. So.
I understand that, but there's a difference between, cars going in and out of a garage and somebody needing a place to park overnight. And we discussed some creative solutions earlier, so I just want to put it out there. And as you know, Mr. Engler, the board can always be sensitive to parking issues. And again, if an Anna's Taquerias goes into the space, it's a lot different than a quiet jewelry store. And there could be other reasons why there's not much traffic coming in and out of the Indian restaurant. Mr. Dinesh, if you would like to say something quickly, could you go up to say it loudly or go up to the podium?
No, I just would like to.
What's your first name?
Yeah, my first name is Danny, last name is Dinesh. I would just like to note that, as you mentioned, Anna's Taqueria and most of the restaurants or retailers, if it's the bookstore or if it's a jewelry store or if it's a restaurant, they don't have parking, and there's a big parking lot just a block away. So that's over 50 spaces for their customers. So it's not like we're proposing something that doesn't exist right now. It's everywhere along the street. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, would anybody on the board here like to make any other question of our parking specialist?
No, I don't have any more questions.
What I would request is that the studies and requests being set forth in the parking report and in the traffic report be followed up by the developer, and I will leave it in Ms. Selko's competent hands to follow through on that, and I thank you very much for your report. And I think we are at the group comment time. No, we are actually it is your time to speak. Mr. Engler, why don't you go up? And I believe it actually is your time to make comments. I didn't mean to bypass you.
No. I was just going to say that we brought our traffic engineer tonight, who is going to talk at a high level about some of the comments that we've heard tonight, and we anticipate providing a more formal written response to some of the comments that we heard tonight.
Absolutely, and didn't want to cut you off at all. The more traffic, the better, in some ways.
Thank you. For the record, my name's Scott Thornton. I'm with Vanessa and Associates, and we prepared a couple traffic assessments for the project. And as Mr. Engler mentioned, I'm not going to get too detailed into or too deep in a response tonight. We appreciate the comments from Ms. Fitzgerald and Mr. Stadig, and there's a few things that we need to work on, we need to look at with them. The one item in particular related to the site distance. There's some issues as far as vantage points and reference points where the site distance measurements are taken. And also, so that has a bearing on what the actual site distance is for vehicles, both approaching on the major road and the site distance for drivers coming out of a minor street, as how far they can see along that major road. So that's something that we have to.
Do you have any pictures that might help with that, or is it just something you're going to address in a?
I think it'd be better if we address when we're on the same page. Literally. And then related to the pedestrian bump out that was mentioned, and we design a lot of them. They're a good, as Mr. Fitzgerald mentioned, they're a good traffic calming device. They also have an application. I mean, there's a certain place for them and a certain place where they may not have the intended effect. And then there's some places where they just don't fit. And one thing, or a couple things that need to be looked at in context of bump outs at this location is, as you mentioned, the geometry and the effects of vehicles coming out, because there is a skew effect of Thorndike Street. So there's going to be a complication for vehicles exiting Thorndike Street, but also any vehicles that are coming through I'm thinking specifically of the fuel trucks that may deliver at the gas station, how they have to get through. So that's something that would have to be looked at. The other key thing really is drainage, because right now Thorndike is on a down gradient. There's a catch basin located around the location of the I guess it would be the southernmost driveway for the site that's closed. There's one catch basin there, and then there's another catch basin. There isn't another catch basin until you're out onto Harvard Street. So right now, any runoff, the storms that we had the last few days, that rainfall would be coming down Thorndike Street. It would want to wrap around the corner, around Thorndike, hit the one catch basin, and then continue around to the catch basin on Harvard Street. If you have a bump out there, that water is most likely going to flood out into Harvard Street, or into Harvard Street. So it's something that we have to look at. It may be, there may be some other things that can be done there. In addition, on the other side of Harvard Street, you have to be careful because that gas station's curb cut is almost, they have two of them really that are almost at the corners. So to put in an effective bump out, which means it has to be wide enough to accommodate wheelchair ramps and ADA compliance, it has to be a certain size, and then it could wind up encumbering their curb cut, and that could be an issue. So those are some things that we need to look at. I will say, as far as regarding the parking and supply of parking, I know a lot of towns have the viewpoint that more parking equals more traffic and less parking equals less traffic. It's not just in this area, it's not just in Cambridge and Somerville and Boston, it's in suburban areas as well. So that's something that should be considered.
Yeah, we had a huge fight about that in town meeting about a year ago, so it's sort of on both sides, and that's how we ended up with this reduced requirement for zoning requirement for parking, but you'll find people on both sides.
Yeah, I don't doubt it. So then, I think that's really it, just in the interest of keeping it short. And, as Mr. Dinesh mentioned, there's a municipal parking lot up off of Fuller. There's a zip car there. As far as, we talked a little bit about alternative transportation. There's a number of other services that are in the area designed to help people leave their cars behind when they come to this site. So.
Ms. Palermo?
I have a question about perhaps another way to resolve the issue about sight at that corner. The pedestrian bump out is one, and you've given us a lot of reasons why that might not solve the problem, particularly with stormwater runoff. What if the building were set back several feet from Harvard and from, what's the cross street? Thorndike.
Yeah.
Would that help?
Part of the difficulty is that when vehicles come out when they come down the street to exit onto Harvard Street, the point at which they actually enter the traveled way is 20 feet at least past the point where they're first supposed to stop. And that point where they're first supposed to stop is actually past where the current edge of the building is. So resetting the building may not have, you may pick up a foot or two, but the point is that no one that I've seen stops at the stop bar and then continues out into Harvard Street. They stop at the stop bar. There's invariably pedestrians crossing the crosswalk. They have to wait until the crosswalk is free, then they can proceed. They have to check to make sure there's no bicycles passing in the bike lane. They have to inch out a little further. So then they're almost into the traveled way of Harvard Street before they can come out. So I don't think that that resetting the building is going to have a big effect on improving the sight distance. And quite honestly, what Mr. Fitzgerald mentioned as far as the parking, and ma'am, you mentioned the removing the parking or reducing the parking
On street.
on street. That would play a big part in improving sight distance. But I don't know where you draw the line with that, because it's that way at Naples Street, it's that way at Russell Street, it's that way at Brainerd Street, it's just Coolidge, all the way down. You have parking spaces right on either side of the intersections. And, they're not, if these, and we haven't looked at crashes at all these other locations. We looked at crashes at this location. One crash a year, and not serious crashes, not substantial in number, doesn't show that there's a safety problem. So, so we look at that all together, and I think it's just something that we'll have to continue to work with your peer consultant on.
So again, back to my question, it sounds like if the building were set back a couple of feet on Thorndike and on Harvard, it might improve the sight for cars, as you said, by a foot or two. So it would have an impact. And coupled with, you've referenced parking on the street. Are you talking about parking on Thorndike Street?
On
or
Harvard
parking on
Street.
Harvard Street?
Yeah.
Okay, well, coupled with the developer has proposed using or putting in metered parking in
Right.
front of the building. And if that were not done so that there was not parking there, would that help?
Well, it could. I'm not sure that would improve things, again, because I think it only makes a difference if you're starting from the position back of the stop line, which no one really does. They proceed through the stop line into the crosswalk and then execute their movement. So I don't think removing those parking spaces makes a great impact, makes a great improvement there. But, if because that's kind of the practical condition of what happens. If you were to remove parking spaces on all of the, abutting all the intersections, then people would be able to pull out from the stop bar and not have to proceed so far into the intersection.
I understand, and I will express my concern that this project as designed may be actually increasing or creating a safety risk at the intersection. As you said, it may not be there now, but now there's an open lot on this site. There's nothing really prohibiting or blocking the sight line on that side. And there's not a lot on the other side either, because you've got a gas station. So you have I'm doing this by memory, but you have a fair amount of open sight lines left and right as you come down Thorndike now. And once this building's there, you're going to lose a lot of it on the right. And that's what I'm trying to resolve. And I recognize you're redesigning the building and you're coming back on July 12th, and I'm looking forward to that.
But can I also say, by underlying zoning, we could do a 40-foot building with no setback on Harvard Street?
But you would have to provide 40 parking spaces. So
Right,
you'd probably be
But you're talking about sightline issues. Parking has nothing to do with it. If we did a 40-foot building on Harvard with no setback, talking about sight distance, that would be the same condition that we're talking about now, and we can do that as of right.
Well, let me ask something. Wouldn't that be subject to the approval of the Transportation and Engineering Department, Polly?
Well, and what
In terms of
else would be
safety?
design review?
Design review?
It would be design review. So anyway, we aren't doing a commercial building here. We're doing a residential and like somewhat small commercial use. And as I said, that's my concern. So any way you can address it, whether it's setting back, and again, as an engineer and your architects, you can play around with it, but pulling it back from Harvard, pulling it back from Thorndike, it would be helpful to understand if that helped, if you could do a study showing us that.
to look at that, and then
I am.
you consult with.
I am. That's exactly what I'm asking. Thank you, Judy.
Okay.
Mr. Hussey?
No more questions.
No, I don't have any questions for you, but effectively, can I call Mr. Fitzgerald back to the stand?
Yes.
I would just like to know if you have anything to say in response to Mr. Thornton's comments about whether or not the building adds to the problems at the intersection, sort of following up.
Well, yeah, in my opinion, I feel as if it's a combination of, the combination of the additional on-street parking, filling in that gap, and having that building along the back edge of sidewalk, I believe, provide more barrier, more visual obstructions than exist there today. So there's not great sight distance there now, and I guess in my opinion, it will be worsened a bit with these changes. And just a few things, when it comes to the curb extensions or bump outs, that's, yeah, absolutely. Whenever any of those are designed, we certainly do have to, or whoever's doing it, would look at turning movements and the truck templates, et cetera, to make sure that it's appropriate. And when it comes to drainage, a lot of times drainage structures do have to be shifted, or perhaps a new drainage structure might be added in. It's typically not a big deal. Typically, you make those adjustments, but certainly you do want to make sure, as you pointed out, that's a very good point, that you'd have to make sure that we're not creating puddles by doing this. As far as shifting the on-street parking, as mentioned, that would, if parking were eliminated, not that I'm proposing eliminating parking because that's typically a big deal, but if on-street parking were cut back from that corner, that would certainly help to improve sight distance. So there are a number of different ways that I'm sure, as they're massaging the drawing a little bit, that they can probably come up with to make things a little bit better.
Okay. Any more questions for any of our parking or traffic experts from the panel? All right, thank you very much. Holly, what's next?
Well, if, it looks like you have time to take some public comment.
Fantastic.
And if people keep it brief and don't repeat what other people said, you can just say, I agree with the person who spoke before me.
Okay,
That's effective.
great. So if people would like to speak, we would like to hear what you have to say. Come up to the lectern, give us your name, your address, and if you agree with the person who just spoke, say, I agree with person X, and please proceed. Thank you. Oh, and save your applause to the end. Thank you. Mr. Herscovici.
Hi, for the record, I'm Steve Herscovici. I live at 87 Thorndike Street. Herscovici. And I usually have to spell Thorndike Street when I'm on the phone with people, but I think you have that. 87? So I think I don't have comments as much as questions at this point. It's unclear to me with respect to the loading dock, two issues. One is it sounds like that's going to cut off the sight lines even more, but sometime between for 4 hours between 5 a.m. and 10 a.m., whether it's 5 to 9 or 6 to 10. And that's prime rush hour when there are a lot of cars coming down Thorndike Street making left turns, I guess is probably the more important turn here, that that the site would be blocked by loading trucks or whatever might be there. And my other concern about that is with respect to pedestrians and children walking into school, that their sight line is going to be blocked by the loading dock, by the trucks that would be in the loading dock during those hours. And I also have just a question about the loading docks generally. I thought deliveries cannot start before 7 a.m., so I'm a little surprised to hear that the loading zone would be a loading zone starting, at 6 a.m. or earlier.
It would comply with local zoning rules. I can't remember if it's 6 or 7 myself.
I'm not sure.
7, yeah. So whatever is required, it will comply with. So not to worry about that.
Okay, but it's still, but it still is a concern that I have, or a question that I have about the loading zone during rush hour. The bump out, as somebody who bikes frequently in that area, the bump out may be a concern as well, to the extent that if there's a sidewalk there, bicyclists don't have the option to move over to the right-hand side of the bike lane if there are no cars there, which is something that we frequently do when there's a bus coming on the street behind us, or a truck or other cars. And so I do have safety concerns about one of the proposed remediation issues. And then just finally, this, just for the record, anyone can look it up on Google Maps, but the right turn from Thorndike Street onto Harvard Street is a much sharper turn than from other streets that were mentioned earlier today. Naples Road, Coolidge, Fuller is also a 90-degree turn, but it has a traffic light, so that's probably less of an issue. Naples, Beals, Coolidge, what am I missing? Stedman Street also has a traffic light. And so I think it should be more of a concern, or at least it is to me, about the sight lines on that street than some of the other streets that were mentioned, even that have parking.
Just to interrupt for 1 minute, could the developer actually do the calculation of what the angle is of the street, Thorndike going into Harvard? Thank you very much.
And those are my own questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
I'm Sue Hasman. I'm at 46 Columbia. My concern is that the strip of roadway between Thorndike and Lawton Russell on Harvard Street is very active little piece of land. So it's not merely a question of the volume of traffic, it's the amount of decisions that are made or involved when you have multiple moving parts going in different directions. You have vehicles entering and exiting from Thorndike, and entering and exiting Harvard Street from 4 positions at Harvard and Thorndike, 3 positions at Harvard and Columbia, 4 positions at Harvard and Russell Lawton, 4 positions at the gas station between Columbia and Harvard, 3 positions at the mini mall in between the proposed parking lot and the mini mall, and specialized traffic at the funeral home. Then you have bicycles entering and exiting Harvard Street from 4 positions at Harvard and Thorndike, 3 positions at Harvard and Columbia, 3 positions at the mini mall, and the parking lot between the proposed project and the mini mall. You've got bicycles easing into Harvard Street from the bike rack that goes there. I think it's 4 months a year. You have pedestrians, including school children, crossing at 4 crosswalks at Harvard and Russell/Lawton, the mini mall to Harvard Street, 4 crosswalks at Harvard and Thorndike Streets. It doesn't take a professional to recognize that this is more than just high volume. It's a lot of moving parts and a lot of decisions needing to be made quickly. So the proposed project is going to add an additional 17 housing units. 13 units will have automobiles exiting on a very small street, which is much smaller and much more restricted in view than in the photos displayed on the slideshow seen previously. 13 will have vehicles that will exit onto a tiny street and then into the area on Harvard. And all 17 will attract visitors, which will either mean more vehicular, pedestrian, or bicycle traffic. Adding a loading dock between the mini mall and Thorndike Street opposite the gas station and the bike rack, deliveries at the loading dock is going to take up space in the roadway. What is the 66 bus going to do when it passes a truck and a loading dock during rush hour? Stand still or go into the oncoming traffic. If you're going to have multiple shops, and each shop has more than one product to offer, how many deliveries are we going to have, and how many delivery trucks are there going to be? Adding shops is also going to add additional traffic on foot or on vehicle. And the slowdown that's going to be created by the increase that's going to be required for people to make safe decisions navigating this small spot is going to back way out Harvard Street. You see it happening all the time. It's called gridlock. As a bicyclist with 44 years of commuting under my belt, I find exiting onto Harvard Street is dangerous. I think at this point, what the change in traffic at that location would be, if the project were to go forward as proposed, would increase the danger level to possibly life-threatening. And I don't think the statistics currently there can predict exactly how it would change with these changes introduced. Thank you.
Thank you. And
I actually forgot one thing. Is there another location along Harvard Street that has this much different entering and exiting activity in the same amount of space? Thank you.
Hi, good evening. My name is Bob Lepson, 36 Thorndike Street, town meeting member, precinct 9 as well. I agree with Steve and I agree with Sue. I think Sue highlighted very, very important consideration about the decision-making processes that are needed and happen all the time. I've got 2 children who have recently learned to drive, and what I have said to them is if you can navigate the corner of Harvard and Thorndike Street, you can go on the Mass Pike and drive New York City. If there's nothing that is more complicated than that intersection at this point, and certainly there is something, a structure of that size would make it even more complex. No question about that. I think that's a very, very good point. My main issue here, which was, I was surprised by this, and perhaps I should be more informed about this. I did not realize that, I guess by regulation, that a building of this size with retail space and the number of housing units would ideally have 36 spaces. Now, I'm a person who believes in less cars, so I don't have a problem with the number of parking spaces being provided for a building of that size, but what it does show me is that this entity is so dense and there's no room on the site to provide even close to the proper number of parking spaces. It's just representative and emblematic of a structure that is way too big and way too oversized for the spot that it is. And that's really the point that I'm trying to get across. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Marion Harris. I live at 82 Thorndike Street, 2 houses away from the proposed development. Mostly I agree with what the other community members have said so far. I agree with Steve about concerns in the morning, particularly about having the loading zone active while kids are getting to school. I'm the mother of 2 young kids. And combined with that, the complexity that Sue mentioned, I absolutely agree with, and I've had conversations in our house, and I'm not sure we've come to the right answer or not, but whether it's actually safer to cross Thorndike Street between Clarence and Harvard rather than at Harvard, because there's so much going on at that intersection between Harvard and Thorndike that for an 11-year-old to kind of keep track and navigate, I think is beyond sort of most 11-year-olds' capacities to do that well. And having trucks there and loading zones and increased, obstruction of sight lines, I think will only make that more complicated. And then I did want to encourage further studies about turning radiuses for getting in and out of the driveway, particularly as their driveway, if I'm remembering correctly, is located across from street parking. So my driveway is located across from street parking, and I can tell you that I frequently have a very hard time getting in and out, and it requires sort of making one approach and then backing up and then approaching and again, and traffic will stop for me while I'm doing this, and it gets worse in the wintertime when there's snow, which theoretically is plowed, but as we all know, it sort of still, really narrows the street and kind of drifts out another foot or so, and so those cars get even closer, and it makes it very hard. So I would want to make sure that these cars really can get in and out without blocking traffic, even leaving aside whether cars can enter or exit at the same time. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Rosen.
Who knows my name here? Hi, everybody. I'm Mark Rosen. I live at 88 Thorndike Street, and I'm a proud citizen of the town of Brookline. And I've come here to speak about this development. And I think one thing everybody in agreement on this side over here and in here pretty much is saying is that this building is way too big for the lot size. It's creating a density that's hard for traffic to deal with, for pedestrians to deal with. Some suggestions I heard tonight was, why don't we just extend the sidewalk into Harvard Street? That's a terrible idea. Harvard Street is extremely busy, is what is known as a very busy thoroughfare. And at the time of the morning, such as rush hour, to narrow that street would be disastrous. It would just cause incredible traffic tie-ups. That traffic is tied up from Comm Ave halfway back to Beacon Street. And Thorndike sits right about in the middle of that. And I live on Thorndike. Now, there's 2 T stops, and I work over at a college. I could take the T. Do I? No. Why? Because the T is terrible. Everybody knows it. Nobody wants to take it unless they actually have to. So what do? I drive. Like most people, I drive to work. And when I leave Thorndike, in order to cross Harvard Street, I have to drive over to Clarence and then down Coolidge so I can take a right on Harvard and then cut across Harvard Street to get across that big, huge river of traffic that Bob Lepson was talking about. It's impossible to cross. And then I go merrily on my way to my job. And when I come back home, I do the opposite. I very rarely can cross over to the other side of Thorndike. I have to make a right on Harvard and then make a left on Coolidge and so forth. So I just wanted to just bring that out into the open. Everybody's talking about moving the street out to accommodate the building. Well, that's kind of unheard of. I mean, I could be old-fashioned, you know. I do have a phone that I'm taking notes on now, right now, so that makes me new-fashioned. But the reality is, why not pull the building back so that it fits into the place that the developer, the very nice Mr. Dinesh, who was just here a moment ago, he's left, but anyway, he's a very nice man, and he owns a piece of property. Why do we have to extend the street to accommodate the property? Why not modify the building in some way? And the architects are good fellows. I can see them all over there sitting very happily, and I know that they can do good work, and I would encourage them to keep working on this design and make a design that actually fits the location. Another question I have before I sit down is about the parking system. I heard it mentioned tonight that, oh, well, we'll pick a vendor at some point. Well, I've given testimony in previous 40B hearings about parking systems, mechanical ones that were recommended that do not function below 50 degrees. And I don't know if anybody in this area knows it, but 50 degrees happens, you know, quite frequently.
Yesterday.
Yeah, it happens yesterday. And to have a parking system fail would cause traffic tie-ups on Thorndike and then out into the other streets. People use Thorndike as a cut-through from Comm Ave to Harvard Street. I know that because we see cars roaring up Thorndike Street all the time, going way beyond speed limit. So I think we need to have a definitive answer of what parking system are you gentlemen going to choose for this site. Maybe have the manufacturer's name, the model number. We'd like to look at the specifications to find out exactly, is this machine going to function in the hardy, cold weather of New England? Because the last time we were talking at a 40B hearing about a parking system, it froze dead in its tracks at about 40 degrees. It slowed down at 50. So I think that's important information. This is important. And people are talking about parking, and the residents in the area aren't talking about parking. Well, I'll have to speak to them to see if you can get some letters in, because I know we're all very concerned about that. And I think maybe the reason why you might not have heard about it in other letters is because we're concerned that this gigantic 40-foot high wall, 70 feet long, is looming over a neighbor's house. So we thought, well, that's more important to talk about than the number of parking spaces, or the fact that you can't see out onto Harvard Street when you're driving, and you might, you know, possibly injure or maim a pedestrian, a motorist, or a bicyclist, as the client's, the developer's traffic person talked about. Is a very busy intersection. And your own peer reviewer said that the building itself most probably would serve to continue to limit visibility there. It's not going to improve the situation. And I know when you start these meetings, I always like it when you start it, because I always like to start our meetings, because when you start it, you say, Mr. Developer, could you please tell me about the improvements that you're going to make to this property? That's a phrase stuck in my mind. I thought that's a really good phrase. So in terms of what improvements are you going to make, what improvements are you going to make so that this building does not compromise this intersection and make it a potential hazard for children, for adults, for elderly people in wheelchairs? We have an elderly center right up the street, and they shop around there. There's lots of stores around and so forth. So those are my concerns, and I think they're reasonable ones. And they look like a bright bunch of fellows over there sitting in the front row. I'm sure they can put their heads together and come up with a really good, rock-solid, down-to-earth solution that doesn't involve modifying the street. Perhaps modifying the design of the building might be a better idea. Okay, thank you so much for letting me speak.
Thank you.
And I'd like to ask for a round of applause. Oh, wait a minute, there's one more. But after him, a nice round of applause for everyone who's spoken.
Okay, thank you.
I will share the applause later. My name is Fred Pinches, F-R-E-D-P-I-N-C-H-E-S. Our family home is at 106 Thorndike Street, just past Clarence Street, approximately 500 feet from the intersection, which is the big topic right now. Number of questions and comments. First of all, the question on the transportation engineer. I don't know how much they study the actual traffic volume and flow on Thorndike Street. I know you can't basically put up a tent and camp out there for 48 or 72 hours. Budget wouldn't allow that. But there are very specific situations over there which may be unusual, if not unique, to the neighborhood and the other streets mentioned. One, as Mr. Rosen had just mentioned over there, Thorndike Street is basically a bypass route from Commonwealth Avenue right through to Harvard Street. It's the first street that you can take after the intersection of Harvard and Com, which is a famous, if not notorious, intersection, which is one reason why Thorndike Street is probably one way beginning at Clarence going all the way down the hill, as you've probably well seen. The volume of traffic is substantial during rush hour. It is high speed, and all day long, it's not just high speed for the commuters or the people going through. It also seems to be the test run for Herb Chambers, BMW, Honda, Porsche, Mini, and whatever else you want. In fact, one of our neighbors, the abutter at 78, who would be most impacted by this development down there, I think he was almost involved in this very serious accident, got into his car, followed the Herb Chambers man back down to the showroom down there, really got into it, didn't do anything stupid or violent to get himself arrested. But I mean, this is a situation that we're dealing with the situation of Thorndike Street, which again, as I said, is unusual. So again, the question is, have they looked at some of this volume and flow and activity a little more than just, I'm not going to say superficial, because that would insult you, and I think you've done a very good job to the point, but you may have to go beyond that point to look at the situation as it exists. Also, there's a lot of activity at the service station on the other side of the street. We have been talking about the garage entrance conflict, widths, this, that, and everything else, and again, very good job to the point which you have done. But again, when you've got all this activity, that is a fairly big service station, which involves service, moving cars from the back lot to the front lot, everything in, out, all the way. Again, the street is basically an extension of their operation. So again, there's potential conflict there. So those would be the two questions on Thorndike Street itself. This idea of putting in a bulb out, I think, could be very detrimental to the whole operation. First of all, the sight lines that we've been talking about seem to be, and again, this would be a question, are we talking about just cars exiting Thorndike Street and turning right onto Harvard Street? Or if you look at the traffic down there, that might be turning left off of Harvard Street onto Thorndike Street. Once you're on Harvard Street down there, people have to make a very fast decision when they can cross the street. Again, expanding the territory of your study. And I know we can't expand too much, budget constraints to begin with, but you've got a traffic light at Fuller Street. When the traffic gets the green light there, you're going to get a bulge of traffic, and that whole section down there to Coolidge to Thorndike, as they basically head down the hill, TJ Maxx, you have very little, except for Thorndike Street, very little conflict of traffic there. So cars are accelerating on a green light. They're accelerating for some distance. So again, you're going to have the potential for accidents there if the cars have to go more out into the street just to make the right turn onto Harvard Street. So I think that's a potential problem that could become much more serious than it is now, particularly when cars trying to make a left turn from Harvard onto Thorndike Street have to make a very quick decision to get through that rush of traffic sometimes, and even routine traffic, to pull into Thorndike Street. And their sight line, I think, is just as important, if not more important, than the traffic coming out of Thorndike Street, which is moving at a much lower speed. So I think there's a potential safety question there. Also, the activity in the neighborhood, and again, we can't expand the territory too much, but we also have large vehicles coming on Thorndike Street, particularly down from Clearflower Bakery, and large vehicles that would now have to go out into the street and make a much wider turn than they are now. So again, that would slow down the traffic, possibly involve that in conflict. So that would be another question that I think we should look at, the whole activity on that corner. And the last thing on the question of the bulb out, I know that 40B prohibits the municipality from charging a developer for infrastructure any more than they would basically charge anyone else. Usually bulb outs are a decision made by the town, transportation board, and whoever. It's a town decision, the town pays for it, but in this case here, the developer may offer to pay for the actual bulb out, but then again, can they be required to pay for all the infrastructure that may go with it, like moving stormwater systems and everything else, even a short distance around the corner, as someone has mentioned, that's going to be an expense for the town. So again, who's going to pay for the whole thing if the whole thing has to go through? So that would be the 5 points over there: traffic and volume on Thorndike Street, activity across the street, possible conflict there, sight lines coming off of Harvard Street, which could be much more dangerous, large vehicles that might be pushed out into the street, and then again the question of cost on infrastructure, if we can pass that along, if the town requires it for this bulb out, which I think would be a mistake. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Pinches.
Yes, my name is Joanne Noble, and I live at 120 Coolidge Street, and I'd like to make two comments. One is the agreement with the fellow residents. I agree with what they've stated so far this evening, and I want to lend my voice to concerns about the parking situation. I think there's I wasn't aware of the diminution of spots for this, for the number of spots down to 13. And living within a few blocks of the area, I'm completely aware of the challenges that the residents have parking right now for all kinds of activities, and wanted to make sure I put my name in that is a concern. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, I'm Sloat Shaw. I live at 88 Thorndike Street. And I wanted to bring up the fact that if you have an underground parking of 13 spots with one lane for the cars going in and going out, that's a really potentially difficult situation for anybody backing in and backing out. It's a small space. And if you look at the people who have just 3 parking spots that they rent out on their driveway, that operation of moving cars in and out crowds the street incredibly. And if people are living there with these spots, they're going to want to go in at rush hour, out at rush hour. Everybody wants to use it at the same time. And I think that one way to approach this problem is to make the entire building smaller so that there's more room in the building and it's not all squished in, trying to make an impossible situation safe. It doesn't feel like it's a safe building, and it doesn't feel like it's designed properly. In order to ensure the neighborhood, after the developers leave, we're stuck with all of the people doing this dance of cars back and forth, and Brookline is in for a really difficult site right here. And I know that as residents of Brookline, these developers have that as their concern, and I'd like them to think about it as something that's essential for all of Brookline.
Thank you very much, Ms. Shaw. Okay, if nobody else is going to speak, you may applaud. And are there any administrative matters we need to deal with, Polly?
Well, it sounds like the traffic issues, maybe you should be, the peer reviewer should be speaking with your traffic consultant.
What I would recommend is we now do you need to step up.
Sure, please, Mr. Engel.
As I mentioned, benefit now of the peer review consulting reports in combination with the design comments we've heard. I think what we're going to do is simultaneous to our design revisions, we're going to prepare a response. I think prior to perhaps issuing a formal response, we may reach out to the peer review consultants through the town who will facilitate to perhaps bounce some ideas, get clarification, say this is what we're going to be proposing, what do you think about it? And thus it's not just a hopscotch back and forth of submit a report, they comment, we comment, try to make it a little bit more collaborative. And I think we have a reasonable amount of time to make some meaningful progress between now and the July 12th hearing. So if it pleases the board and the planning department, that's what I would recommend. I mean, we obviously have email addresses, but any communication we have will run through Polly and her team, so the town and the board is kept informed relative to what's going on.
I think that makes sense. My colleagues seem to agree. Planning department?
Yes, I think that's a
Okay.
good idea. So I think you can move to continue this meeting
Okay.
to July 12th, and at that time, we will be discussing both design and traffic issues.
Okay. Then we will be adjourned until July 12th, and maybe it will go above 50 by then. Let's cross our fingers. Thank you very much.